The envelope sat unopened on the kitchen counter for 3 days before Elena finally tore it open, already knowing what it would say. Final notice. Tuition balance due. The numbers blurred together, the same way they had every month for the past year. Red ink, harsh deadlines, threats wrapped in polite institutional language. She folded the letter and pressed her palms against her eyes, feeling the familiar tightness in her chest that came from doing math she already knew wouldn't work. Her apartment held little more than a mattress, a stack of library books, and the hum of a refrigerator that rattled louder than it cooled. 26 years old, and everything she owned could fit into the trunk of her car. She had painted once, back when she believed talent alone could carry her somewhere. Now she waited tables until midnight and told herself exhaustion was temporary. The call about her grandmother's house had come 2 weeks earlier. Foreclosure proceedings. 30 days to clear it out or lose whatever remained inside to the bank. Elena hadn't set foot in that house since the funeral, hadn't wanted to face the rooms that still smelled like her grandmother's lavender soap and old paper. She drove there anyway, because she had no choice, and because somewhere beneath the grief was a small, aching hope that there might be something worth saving. Furniture to sell, anything to soften the blow of the tuition bill waiting back home. The house greeted her in silence. Dust motes drifted through slanted afternoon light. Furniture sat draped in white sheets like sleeping ghosts. She moved from room to room, each one emptier than the last, each one a quiet reminder of a life reduced to boxes and debt. At the end of the hallway, a narrow door stood slightly ajar, one she didn't remember ever being allowed to open as a child. Her fingers found the handle. The hinges groaned, long unused, as the door swung inward into darkness. The attic breathed a different kind of air, thick with dust and the faint sweetness of old cedar. Elena pulled a chain, and a single bulb flickered to life, casting long shadows across stacks of forgotten belongings. Boxes labeled in her grandmother's careful handwriting lined the walls, each one a small time capsule waiting to be opened. She knelt beside the nearest box and lifted out a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon, the paper soft and yellowed with age. She recognized none of the names. Her grandmother had never spoken much about her past, not the years before Elena was born, not the life she'd lived across an ocean before settling into quiet, unremarkable American suburbia. Elena had always assumed there was nothing to tell. Photographs slipped from an envelope, black and white faces frozen mid-laugh, mid-argument, mid-secret. A young woman who might have been her grandmother stood in front of a building Elena didn't recognize, her expression unreadable, guarded in a way that didn't match the warm, flour-dusted woman Elena remembered from childhood kitchens. Further back, propped against the slanted wall, canvases leaned in a row, amateur landscapes, a bowl of fruit, a garden Elena vaguely remembered from summer visits. Ordinary paintings, the kind sold at estate sales for a few dollars each. She lifted them one by one, sorting what could be saved from what would be discarded. The last canvas stopped her. It was smaller than the others, framed in dark, aged wood, and far heavier than its size suggested, as though something dense had been packed inside rather than simply stretched canvas and paint. Her fingers traced the frame's edge and caught on something wrong, a seam that shouldn't exist, a hairline gap where would met would unnaturally, as if the frame had been opened before and sealed again by careless, hurried hands. Elena turned the painting over slowly in the dim light, her pulse quickening with a curiosity she couldn't yet explain. Elena carried the painting closer to the bulb, tilting it until the weak light caught the surface at an angle. That was when she saw it, a faint discoloration beneath the varnish, a shadow of lines that didn't belong to the garden scene painted on top. She had spent enough hours in studio classes to recognize the signs of old, cracked oil paint, the fine web of fractures that spread across a canvas over decades. But this was different. Beneath the cracks, something else showed through, like a second photograph developing underneath the first. Her breath caught. She turned the canvas at another angle, and there it was again. A curve that looked almost like the edge of a shoulder, a suggestion of shading too deliberate to be accidental damage. Someone had painted over something, and whoever had done it hadn't been careful enough to hide it completely. Elena's hands trembled slightly as she set the painting down on an old chest and knelt beside it, studying the corner where the frame seam had caught her attention earlier. She hesitated only a moment before reaching for a thin metal nail file from her bag, sliding it gently beneath the lifted edge of paint where a small chip had already begun to flake away. The paint came away easier than she expected, brittle with age, crumbling into pale dust against her fingertips. Beneath it, graphite lines emerged, faint, hurried strokes, the unmistakable hand of a sketch rather than a finished work. A fragment of a face, the suggestion of a collar, a hand, something that might have been a window in the background. Her heart pounded as she stared at it, her mind racing faster than she could organize her thoughts. This wasn't a garden painted over a garden. This was something deliberately concealed, layered and buried beneath ordinary brushstrokes so that no one would think to look twice. Why would anyone hide a sketch like this? And why beneath one of her grandmother's paintings, tucked away in an attic no one had entered in years? Elena sat back on her heels, the dust settling around her, and realized she was no longer looking at a piece of furniture to sell. She was looking at a secret. She didn't sleep that night. The painting sat propped against her kitchen wall, half-lit by the glow of her laptop screen, and Elena found herself staring at it the way one might stare at a stranger who somehow knew her name. She photographed the exposed corner from every angle, zooming in on the graphite lines until her eyes ached, searching for anything that might explain what she was looking at. The search began clumsily, vague terms typed into a search bar with little hope of finding anything. Hidden sketch under painting. Old graphite drawing found in attic. Nothing useful surfaced. But when she tried describing the fragment itself, the curve of the collar, the faint suggestion of a window, the loose, confident lines of the hand that had drawn it, something shifted. An archived newspaper article appeared, scanned and grainy, dated decades before she was born. She almost scrolled past it. Then a single word in the headline stopped her cold. Stolen. The article described a small European museum, a theft that had occurred more than 60 years earlier, and a preparatory sketch believed lost to history, a study connected to a much larger, celebrated work. Investigators at the time suspected the piece had been smuggled out of the country during the post-war chaos, sold quietly through underground channels, and never recovered. The museum had offered a reward for information. No one had ever come forward. Elena sat back, her pulse loud in her own ears. The contrast struck her with dizzying force. An object she'd nearly discarded as worthless attic clutter might, if the fragments matched, be worth more than she could imagine. Not just money. History. A missing piece of the past that historians had searched for since before her mother was born. And it had been sitting beneath an amateur garden painting, hidden with deliberate, careful hands. Her grandmother's hands. The realization settled over her slowly, chilling despite the warmth of the apartment. Her grandmother hadn't simply owned an old sketch. She had hidden it, sealed it inside a frame, buried it under paint, tucked it away in an attic no one was meant to enter. Why would a quiet, gentle woman guard a secret like this for 60 years? The email arrived 4 days later, sitting quietly in her inbox between a tuition reminder and a coupon for a grocery store she never shopped at. The subject line read simply, "Regarding a recent discovery." Elena's stomach dropped before she even opened it. The message was polished, professional, almost disarmingly warm. The sender introduced himself as a private art consultant, someone who worked discreetly with collectors and estate holders to authenticate and place rare pieces with the right buyers. He claimed to have heard, through what he called circles that pay attention to these things, that she might have come into possession of something historically significant. He offered to handle everything: authentication, provenance research, a confidential sale to a collector who would pay generously and ask no questions. The number he mentioned made Elena's breath catch. It was enough to erase her tuition debt twice over, enough to rebuild a life she'd almost stopped imagining. For a moment, sitting alone in her cramped apartment with unpaid bills stacked on the counter, the offer felt like salvation dropped into her lap exactly when she needed it most. But something nagged at her as she reread the message a second time. He described the sketch's dimensions. The faint curve of the collar. Details she had never posted anywhere, never mentioned to a single soul except the empty search bar of her own laptop at 2 in the morning. How could he know that? Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, uncertainty creeping cold through her chest. The email ended with a line that lodged itself under her skin and refused to let go. I should mention, discreetly, you are not the only one who has noticed. Others are already looking. I'd hate for you to lose this opportunity to someone less patient than myself. Elena stared at the screen long after the words stopped making sense, the warmth of the offer curdling into something sharper. Whoever this man was, he already knew more about her discovery than she was comfortable with. And somewhere out there, apparently, others did too. Elena spent the next morning trying to trace the man who had emailed her, and the deeper she searched, the more unsettled she became. His name returned no meaningful results, no gallery affiliations, no client testimonials, no digital footprint of any kind beyond the email address itself. Legitimate consultants left trails, articles, auction records, professional listings. This man left nothing. He existed only in the words he had chosen to send her, and that absence felt louder than anything he could have written. She told herself it was probably nothing. Freelancers operated quietly sometimes, especially in a world built on discretion and private sales. But the explanation didn't sit right, no matter how many times she repeated it to herself. That evening, walking home from her shift, she felt it for the first time, the prickling certainty of being watched. A car idled too long at the corner near her building. A man across the street seemed to look away just a beat too quickly when she glanced up. She told herself it was exhaustion, paranoia born from too little sleep and too much stress. She almost believed it, until she reached her apartment door and found it unlocked. Her heart lurched. She was certain she had locked it that morning, the way she always did, twice, out of habit born from years of living alone. She pushed the door open slowly, breath held, scanning the small space for anything missing. Nothing was gone. Her laptop still sat on the counter. Her wallet remained untouched in her bag. But things had moved. The stack of mail she'd left squared on the table now sat slightly askew. A drawer she always kept shut hung open half an inch. The painting itself, wrapped and hidden beneath her bed, had been shifted, not stolen, just enough to prove someone had found it and chosen, deliberately, to leave it exactly where she would notice. Elena stood frozen in the doorway of her own home, the fear settling deep and physical in her chest. Elena didn't call the police. She had turned the idea over in her mind for an hour, weighing it against everything she couldn't prove. No fingerprints, nothing stolen, nothing but a shifted drawer and a feeling she couldn't put into words that would sound rational to a stranger in uniform. Instead, she sat on the floor of her apartment with a painting in her lap, and for the first time since finding it, she let herself ask what she actually wanted. Money would have solved her tuition problem. Money would have made the fear go away, at least for a while. But money would also mean handing her grandmother's secret to a man with no name, no history, and no reason to tell the truth about where it came from or why it had been hidden. Elena thought of the guarded young woman in the photograph, the careful hands that had sealed graphite beneath paint and buried it for 60 years. Whatever her grandmother had been protecting, it deserved more than a quiet, anonymous sale to make someone else's problem disappear. She wanted the truth. She wanted her grandmother's name attached to whatever this was, honestly and publicly, not laundered into a private collection where the story would vanish along with the object itself. That decision made everything more dangerous. She packed quickly that night, wrapping the sketch in cloth and sliding it into the bottom of an old duffel bag, layered beneath clothes that no longer mattered. She left before dawn, driving with no clear destination, checking her mirrors more than the road ahead. Somewhere during the sleepless hours of research that had led her here, she'd stumbled across a listing that now felt less like coincidence and more like a lifeline, an international art authentication conference, scheduled in just under 2 weeks, drawing historians, museum curators, and provenance experts from around the world. A public setting. Witnesses. Experts who couldn't be intimidated into silence the way a frightened graduate student could. If she could reach it, if she could get the sketch authenticated and revealed in front of people who mattered, the secret would no longer belong to her alone. She just had to survive long enough to get there. Dr. Marlowe's name surfaced twice during her research, both times attached to the same reputation: brilliant, meticulous, and long retired from the politics of the museum world he'd once dominated. He lived 2 states away, in a small university town, teaching a single seminar course each semester and otherwise keeping to himself.
No scandals.
No suspicious silence, like the collector who still emailed her every few days, his tone shifting from polite to insistent to something colder underneath the courtesy. Elena arrived at his office unannounced, the duffel bag heavy against her shoulder, her nerves stretched thin from 2 days of driving and too little sleep. The man who opened the door looked exactly as academic as she'd expected: silver hair, wire-rimmed glasses, a cardigan that had seen better decades. He studied her with the particular skepticism of someone who had spent a lifetime being approached by people convinced they'd found a masterpiece in their basement. "I get emails like yours weekly," he said, not unkindly, but firm enough to make her chest tighten. "Attics are full of hope and very little else." She almost turned around, almost let the exhaustion and fear talk her out of trusting one more stranger. Instead, she unwrapped the sketch and set it on his desk without a word. Marlowe's skepticism faltered the moment he leaned over it. He pulled a jeweler's loupe from a drawer with the practiced ease of muscle memory, angling the desk lamp until the graphite lines caught the light. His breathing changed, slow and measured, the way Elena imagined a man might breathe when confronted with something he'd stopped expecting to see. "Where," he said quietly, "did you find this?" She told him everything: the painting, the hidden layer, the newspaper clipping, the man with no name who already knew details she'd never shared. Marlowe listened without interrupting, his eyes never leaving the sketch, his skepticism replaced by something sharper and more careful. "If this is real," he finally said, "you're not just holding a lost drawing." He looked up at her, and for the first time, his expression held something closer to alarm than doubt. "You're holding a target." Marlowe's office became a war room over the next 2 days, its walls slowly disappearing behind archival photographs, shipping manifests, and yellowed museum records pulled from private academic databases most people never knew existed. He worked with the quiet intensity of a man who had waited decades for a puzzle worthy of his attention, and Elena found herself swept along in his focus, grateful for the distraction from her own exhaustion and fear. The theft, they learned, hadn't been the work of ordinary criminals. It had happened during the chaotic final months of a war that had scattered countless works of art across borders, sold through underground networks that dealt in desperation as much as greed. Provenance trails vanished deliberately, buried beneath false names and forged documents designed to protect not thieves, but survivors, people using stolen art as currency to buy safety, transport, silence. Marlowe found the connection late on the second night, his voice unusually quiet when he finally spoke. A shipping manifest, partially preserved, listed a name that matched the young woman in Elena's photographs. Not as a buyer, not as a thief in the way Elena had feared, as a courier. The pieces began arranging themselves into a shape Elena hadn't expected. Her grandmother hadn't stolen the sketch for profit. She had carried it, smuggled it, perhaps, alongside herself and whatever family she'd been trying to protect, through a period when the difference between valuable and worthless could mean survival or death. Somewhere along that journey, the sketch had never made it back to the people who should have received it. Whether by circumstance, fear, or something Elena couldn't yet name, her grandmother had kept it, hidden it, and carried its secret in silence for the rest of her life.
Hero. Thief.
Protector. Elena turned the words over and found none of them fit cleanly, and somehow that felt more honest than any single answer could have. She wasn't trying to profit from it, Marlowe said gently, watching Elena's face. I think she was terrified of what would happen if the wrong people found out she still had it. Elena thought of the collector's emails, patient and cold, and understood with sudden clarity that her grandmother's fear had never really ended. It had simply been passed down to her. The email that arrived on the third morning was different from the others. Gone was the polite, patient tone Elena had grown uneasily accustomed to. In its place was something colder, sharper, edged with the confidence of a man who no longer felt the need to hide behind courtesy. Attached to the message was a document, a bill of sale, dated decades earlier, bearing a signature that vaguely resembled her grandmother's but wasn't quite right, the kind of forgery convincing enough to a casual eye and worthless under real scrutiny. The message beneath it was brief and unmistakably a threat dressed as reason. The sketch, it claimed, had already been legally sold long ago. Elena had no rightful claim. Continuing to involve historians and authentication conferences would only invite legal consequences she couldn't afford, financially or otherwise. Marlowe read it over her shoulder in silence, then set his glasses down with deliberate calm. "He's panicking," he said. "Forged provenance is a last resort, not a first move. He didn't expect you to get this far." Elena wanted to feel reassured. She didn't. The confrontation came that same evening, sudden and physical in a way no email had prepared her for. A car she didn't recognize sat parked outside Marlowe's building when they left his office, engine running, headlights off. A man stepped out before they reached their own car. Well-dressed, calm, the same practiced politeness from his emails now stretched thin over something harder underneath. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He spoke of lawyers, of how quickly reputations could be destroyed, of how easily an unverified claim from a struggling graduate student could be buried under enough legal pressure. His eyes moved to the bag in Marlowe's hands, and for one suspended moment, Elena believed he might simply take it. Marlowe stepped between them, his voice steady despite his age, despite the danger folded into the stranger's calm. "This piece is being authenticated publicly," he said, "in front of people who will ask exactly the questions you're afraid of." The man's smile thinned. He said nothing further, only looked at Elena with an intensity that promised this wasn't over, before turning and disappearing into the waiting car. Elena realized, hands shaking, that they were no longer just being watched. They were being hunted. The conference hall filled slowly, rows of folding chairs facing a raised stage beneath bright, unforgiving lights. Elena stood backstage with the sketch cradled against her chest, its weight no longer just physical. Marlowe adjusted his tie beside her, calmer than she felt, though she noticed his hands weren't entirely steady either. She scanned the crowd through the gap in the curtain and found him almost immediately, the collector, seated near the back, dressed like any other attendee, patient and composed in a way that made her stomach twist. He had followed them here, exactly as she'd feared he would. But for the first time, she understood something Marlowe had told her the night before. In a room full of witnesses, his patience meant nothing. When her name was called, Elena walked onto the stage on legs that felt borrowed from someone braver. The lights blurred the audience into a soft wall of faces, and for a moment, panic threatened to close her throat entirely. Then she thought of her grandmother's hands, sealing graphite beneath paint, protecting a secret through decades of silence and fear.
She began to speak.
She told them about the attic, the hidden layer beneath ordinary paint, the newspaper clipping that had unraveled everything. Marlowe took over when the history required his expertise, laying out the provenance research, the wartime shipping manifest, the name that placed her grandmother not among thieves, but among the desperate and the brave, carrying stolen fragments of history to safety through chaos that had swallowed so much else without a trace. A murmur moved through the audience as the true weight of the discovery settled over the room. This wasn't simply a lost sketch resurfacing after 60 years. It was proof of survival, of quiet courage exercised in the margins of history where no one had thought to look. Elena watched the collector's expression shift from the back row, composure cracking, the calculated calm of a man who thrived in shadows now stripped bare under fluorescent light and dozens of watching eyes. Someone near him whispered, phones lifted to capture the moment. He rose from his seat and left without a word, his forged documents and quiet threats worthless against a truth spoken aloud, publicly, permanently. Applause rose around her, warm and unexpected, and Elena felt something long clenched in her chest finally begin to loosen. Her grandmother was no longer a woman with a hidden, shameful secret. She was a protector, finally seen. The weeks that followed moved faster than Elena could fully process. The public exposure at the conference had done what months of quiet investigation never could. It forced attention, official and unavoidable. Journalists who had captured the collector's hasty exit began digging into his identity, uncovering a trail of aliases connected to a black market network long suspected by international authorities of moving looted wartime art through private, untraceable sales. He wasn't the mysterious, powerful figure his emails had once made him seem. He was simply one more link in a chain that had operated in the shadows for decades, relying on fear and silence to keep pieces like Elena's sketch hidden from the world. With his exposure, that silence broke completely. The museum that had lost the sketch 60 years earlier reopened its case, this time with a name, a face, and a courier's forgotten story to finally close it. Officials confirmed what Marlowe's research had already suggested. Elena's grandmother had never intended to profit from what she carried. She had preserved it, protected it through danger Elena could barely imagine, and the museum's gratitude reflected that truth rather than treating her as a thief who had simply evaded capture. Legal recognition came formally a month later. Elena was named the rightful discoverer and heir, her grandmother's role in the piece's survival documented and honored publicly for the first time. Alongside the recognition came something Elena hadn't allowed herself to hope for through all the fear and running, a settlement from the museum, generous enough to erase her tuition debt entirely and rebuild the foundation she'd nearly lost beneath years of quiet struggle. Elena returned to the house one final time, on a quiet afternoon when the light fell soft and gold through the windows, nothing like the harsh bulb glow of the night she'd first climbed the attic stairs. The bank had granted an extension once her name began appearing in the news, and now the house belonged to her outright, purchased free of the debt that had once threatened to take it away entirely. The attic looked different now, though nothing about it had physically changed. The boxes still sat where she'd left them, the dust still hung faintly in the air, but Elena moved through the space, without the desperation that had once colored every corner of it. She sat on the floor where she'd first found the painting and let herself simply remember, not the fear of the collector, not the frantic research, but her grandmother's hands, careful and quiet, stitching safety out of chaos long before Elena had ever been born. She understood her now in a way she never had while she was alive. Not simply as a gentle woman who baked bread and hummed while gardening, but as someone who had carried unbearable weight in silence, choosing protection over profit, safety over recognition, for 60 long years. The sketch had been fully restored by the time the museum unveiled its new exhibit, cleaned and preserved beneath protective glass, displayed alongside a placard that finally told the truth. Elena stood before it during the opening, reading her grandmother's name printed beneath the piece, not as a footnote, not as a suspect, but as the woman who had saved it. Visitors moved past the display, pausing to read the story of wartime courage and hidden sacrifice, and Elena watched quietly from a distance, feeling something settle deep inside her chest. Her grandmother's secret was no longer buried in an attic, hidden beneath paint and silence. It stood in the light now, exactly where it belonged. Elena's apartment looked different now, though she hadn't changed much about it. New paint on the walls, a bookshelf finally filled with more than library loans, a small framed print of the sketch hanging near her desk, a gift from the museum she treasured more than anything money could have bought. The unpaid tuition notices were gone, replaced by a diploma she'd finally earned without the constant shadow of debt trailing behind her. She had returned to painting, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence, filling canvases with images that felt entirely her own. Sometimes, late at night, she thought about how close she'd come to selling the sketch quietly, erasing her debt without ever learning the truth it carried. She understood now that some debts weren't meant to be settled that way. Some truths were worth more than the danger required to uncover them. Her grandmother's story had become part of her own, woven permanently into who she was becoming, no longer just a woman surviving month to month, but someone who had faced fear directly and refused to look away from it. On quiet evenings, she still thought of that first afternoon, the creak of the attic door swinging open into darkness, unaware of what waited inside. She had walked into that house believing she had nothing left to lose. She had walked out having found everything that mattered. Elena closed her laptop, the museum's exhibit page still glowing faintly on the screen. Her grandmother's name printed beneath a piece of history finally returned to light. She glanced toward the window, where evening settled soft and golden over the city, and felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, entirely at peace. Some doors, once opened, could never truly close again.
And she no longer wanted them to.